Alex Kliment from GZero Media is joining us to talk about everything Russia-Ukraine related. Alex, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Pleasure to be here. Let's talk.
Exactly. And can we please talk to you, Alex? Emphasis on the please.
Always on brand, this guy.
Right. Well, remember, Can We Talk? It's a Jewish women's podcast. So listen,
fair enough.
Alex, a question for you right off the top, because there was obviously some breaking news as we're recording tonight for people listening Thursday morning. Obviously, the U.S. now has declared what Russia is doing in the region and war crimes that have happened in this invasion on Ukraine. President Biden's over there now. He just recently landed, as of this taping, in Belgium, meeting with some foreign leaders in the coming days. I want to get some of your takeaways just on both of them, just right off the bat, since it's recently happening and breaking as we're recording this. First, your thoughts on the U.S. declaring the war crimes that have been committed in this invasion on Ukraine, and then also what you expect out of President Biden's trip meeting with world leaders out in Belgium.
Well, I mean, the U.S. calling out other countries for war crimes, obviously it sends a certain message. War crimes, when they are committed, are horrible, but war crimes, as far as they're being prosecuted, depends on who's willing to take them to court and process them and what they're willing to do about them, right? I mean, the history of prosecuting war crimes is not a great one, I have to say. Also, it bears noting that the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and neither is Russia. So it's not clear. I mean, what Russia is doing in Ukraine certainly rises to the level of war crimes, if we're to believe what we've been seeing. I'm not sure that the actual impact of this is that great beyond the U.S. signaling, hey, Russia's doing some really horrible things. The people in the world who are inclined to believe that and see what they're seeing from Ukraine will say, yes, we already knew that. Those who are inclined to deny what's going on in Ukraine will probably deny it all the same. I'm not sure it moves things forward all that much. As far as Biden going to Europe this week, I think there's two important things he's trying to accomplish. One is, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw this tremendous and really surprisingly fast sort of unified response from Europe and the United States, right? It had taken years of sort of these anguished arguments about how much can we sanction Russia? Are we provoking Putin or not provoking Putin? Is it going to go too far? Will it stop him from doing what he's doing in Ukraine? After Russia invaded Ukraine, the response was surprisingly swift and surprisingly unified in terms of these packages of sanctions on Russia. But I think a big question that the Americans and Europeans need to work out is, are there any circumstances under which they might roll back some sanctions, right? I mean, there's various moving pieces if you're trying to think about what could be a settlement for this conflict, right? You have to get the Russians to agree to certain things and compromise to certain things. You have to get the Ukrainians to agree to certain things and make certain compromises. But the elephant in the room for all of that is, okay, if that happens, is the West or Europe and the United States prepared to roll back some sanctions on the Russian regime? So I think that's something that Biden's going to want to talk a lot about with the European leaders. I think there's also, the Europeans have a number of key meetings coming up with China in the next couple of weeks. And I think there's also going to be a lot going on behind the scenes in Europe where the Europeans and Americans are trying to sort of get on the same page about a unified front, if such a thing is possible, against Beijing. So I think those are the two things that you're going to hear a lot about in the wake of Biden's trip.
Alex, there was an article that you recently put out around trying to make sense of Russian polling data. Like, what are we learning from the country, but also understanding important context as to what does it mean to gain insights from citizens in Russia? What I'll use the word blinders in this case, from those in the more rural areas versus younger audiences in the city. For our audience, Alex, what would people make sense of? Because at face value, to hear Russian polling data in a country of what feels like a totalitarian regime, how do you trust insights from citizens? But from your article, what should we make sense of in terms of what that information is telling us? And also contextually, what differences are we seeing between a younger generation of Russians versus those whose information is coming more from a state level perspective?
It's a great question, and it's a tough question to answer. Let's start with what we know from the sociologists who are doing opinion polling in Russia right now, And there's some caveats to that I'll get to. But what the pollsters who are doing the work say is that about 60% of the population from their studies supports the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There are a couple of caveats to that. One is those opinions divide a lot by different demographics, right? So as you mentioned, the older populations who tend to live in smaller cities, who tend to get their news primarily from television rather than from social media or online sources. Those types of people tend to be much more supportive of the state narrative, much more kind of nationalistic in their outlook to begin with. And that's where you have the really kind of the real basis of support for the invasion. You also have big cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow are obviously the two biggest ones, but there are other cities of more than 1 million people in Russia where you find a different invasion, or at least up until recently, you had a fairly different information environment where you had a younger population, people more getting their news more from online sources, from social media, reading foreign press, to the extent that they can or have interest in, and that in those places you already had a sort of the nucleus of opposition to Putin's government and regime, right? These are the people who were going out in the streets in 2011 and 2012. These are the people who have gone out in protests, for political reasons ever since. Obviously, less and less frequently as the laws have gotten tighter. So you really do have this kind of bifurcated thing, not unfamiliar to an American audience in a lot of ways, right? I mean, you have people who follow a certain TV narrative about things, older, kind of more, less well-off, lower education levels, tend to have the more hardline views. So that's one big caveat, is that it's split. The biggest caveat, as you alluded to, is in a country where the narrative is so controlled on state media, mainly television, and where since the war started, almost all of the social media sources have been shuttered, right? Facebook's been closed, Twitter's been closed, Instagram's been closed, Telegram still thrives in Russia, but most of the other ones have been closed. And they have passed laws that say you can go to jail for up to 15 years for spreading misinformation about the war, right? And their idea of misinformation about the war is that you call it a war, right? Because officially, you're supposed to call it a special operation or a special military operation, right? So given all of that, how much can we even trust what's coming out of Russia? People even telling opinion pollsters, you call someone up, you think they're going to answer honestly? And the question, I put this question to the head of one of the polling agencies, the last independent polling agency in Russia, and he said, look, it depends what question you're trying to answer. If you're trying to use polling in an authoritarian society to answer what, Ivan Ivanovich, right, Joe Blogs, sitting at his kitchen table, thinks about the regime, you're not going to learn that from polling data, because it is true that Ivan Ivanovich is going to be scared or is going to self-censor his views. So as far as what he thinks in his heart of hearts, when he's at home, cursing, maybe he's sitting at his kitchen table cursing Vladimir Putin, maybe he's not, you're not going to find that out from polling. What you are going to find out from polling is how comfortable is Ivan Ivanovich about acting in opposition to the government in public when he has to answer a question about it, right? And that's an important distinction, because it does tell you a lot that, that a majority of the population, whether because they're scared or because they actually believe it, supports this war and supports this, what's going on. The other thing I would say is that, it's not just about this one war. I mean, there has been the information environment, the kind of the way that the government, particularly through the television and state media, has been kind of creating this or inflaming this narrative of grievance against the West in general, and this idea that Ukraine in particular is a puppet of the West, is run by neo-Nazis, but somehow also, and this is very peculiar, but somehow also is like, a Trojan horse for all kinds of horrific progressive ideas that are going to poison the civilizational purity of Russia. Like, people really believe this stuff. There is a huge bedrock of this underlying worldview. So it's not just about whether people think the war is good or not. It grows out of this whole other thing, which is not just about, hey, do you support the war or not? So yeah, so that was kind of a long answer, but I think the thing to bear in mind is that, yes, there is a lot of support in Russia. And even if that's because there is this information environment, that's still useful information. The one other thing I would say, though, is that it's not necessary to have a super closed information environment for there to be a huge amount of support for a very dumb war, right? I mean, if you think back to 2003, 2004 in the United States, 75% of the population supported the Iraq war in 2003, 2004. And I don't mean that as a kind of like whataboutist kind of like field goal. I mean it just to make the point that there are forces at work when a country starts a war. There can be these jingoistic spasms that can happen irrespective of whether the state television is forcing people to think one thing or another, right? The United States is an open democracy, with a free press, and even in that situation, a huge number of people supported a war that was questionable at best and ended up in a lot of ways being a disaster.
Follow up to that, Alex, and it's interesting because you bring up from the standpoint of a Russian citizen, social media actually is an opportunity to hear, if I heard you correctly, to actually see true information or objective information. To simply be a television watcher, as you had said, would be to consume to consume basic. I'll use the word propaganda to be simplistic here. That's right. That seems in contrast to in the United States, sort of theoretically how we operate. But there is a growing swath of Americans that fall into this trap of fake news. Like, that's a word we've heard a lot in this country. How do you sort of contrast, or how do you explain to people that in the US, because of the way the media is run, and it's really not all that influenced, or maybe some networks more so than others, by the White House, how that is in direct contrast to a country like Russia, and I imagine others, China maybe being another one of them, where that concept of being a consumer of actually televised news or newspapers, what have you, is actually legitimate, and what social media may bring to the forefront may actually be toxic. Because in the US, it seems, Mike and I have talked about this on the show, where we would think the opposite. I mean, as an American, you would think what I'm consuming on television, I can be discerning, what I can read, with a discerning eye, is probably more grounded in truth, in fact, than simply pulling things from social media. So I'm stunned by the fact that you just basically spun it on its head as it relates to Russia.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't even thought of that, but as you explain it, yeah, it is sort of bizarre. I guess one thing is that in Russia, all the television stations now are state controlled, right? When Putin came to power in 2000, there were various channels which were under the control. They weren't they were independent in the sense that they weren't controlled by the state, but they were controlled by powerful oligarchs who were very keen to use them for their own advantage, right? So one of the things that from Putin's perspective, was, the fact that oligarchs can run, television stations and use them to advance their own political agendas, which they were, in fairness, doing throughout most of the 90s. That is a source of weakness for the state, and that needs to be stamped out, right? So like from 2002, 2003 onward, Putin made a big effort to bring the TV channels under direct or indirect state control. Today, there's no television in Russia that is not state controlled. The last independent broadcaster was called TV Rain. They left 2 weeks ago. So they're not, there's basically, TV is state controlled in Russia. And about 75% of the Russian population, he says, they get their news primarily from television. Again, if you look at the age breakdown, it flips almost entirely once you're talking about people who are 18 to 30 or 18 to 35. There, it's like 30 or 40% say TV is the number one thing. 60% say the internet is. So in Russia, you're not getting a multiplicity of views on television, and B, political views, and B, it's all coming really from one source. So, and that source happens to be interested in shaping a very particular narrative using, as you say, propaganda. So social media is by no means, the angel in all of this in Russia. It's just that social media is the place where you can, if you seek it, get that multiplicity of views on what's happening in any given story. I mean, state television in Russia is absolutely crazy these days. I was just watching last night. There was literally a story where this is like on the 7 o'clock news, basically. Guy gets up and he has a big banner behind him that says, mercenaries of Satan, right? So I clicked on that. That looks interesting. And the guy's doing a whole stand-up about how there are satanic mercenaries fighting on behalf of the West in Ukraine, right? This is not like some fringe show. This is like the 7 o'clock news. It's like, well, there's satanic mercenaries fighting in Ukraine. And tomorrow in Moscow, it'll be 37 degrees with light showers. Like, it was not framed as something great. It was just like, this is news. The news is that there are Satanists in Ukraine.
It's like Pizzagate on television.
I was going to say, so it's like Jesse Waters on Fox News. Alex, I say that as a Fox News producer. We should also, as a caveat, explain that Alex speaks Russian. So watching it is way better than Nick and I, or maybe any of you listening, because he knew what was being said. Alex, I want to ask you, staying on this misinformation campaign. It's a two-parter, and I'll get to the second part after your first response. But you did something recently on what Russia is doing to ban certain words. You mentioned even about they won't call this an invasion or a war. They call it a special operation. We've seen Kremlin, the spokespersons say the same thing. It's trickling all the way down. But then I look at some of these numbers and some of the episodes that we've done in recent weeks as we update people in real time about the stats and data. 15,000 Russian troops dead. If 15,000 American troops died, there would be in any conflict over 3 weeks, there would be massive protest here in the US. And you're not, other than the beginning part of this, where you heard about the early onset protests and the arrest, you haven't seen any of that coming out of Russia. So I'm curious on your take of all of the information, the way it's trickling down to consumer. If you can continue to elaborate on like what Russia is doing on banning certain words and coverage, but then also we can't confirm some of the stuff that the Ukrainian officials are saying. Like, even people have been asked from Senate Intel committees, and I'll get to that in a second, but like, hey, 15,000 troops, well, that number may be a little high. And it's like, how is it that high? How we're not getting actual information. And some of that is because, we can't get people in and out of the country, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd love to get your take on this misinformation all across the board, but to a bigger extent on the Russian side of this.
Well, look, I think it's important to remember that right now you have a war between two countries that are very good at playing, or have tried to play, the kind of social media disinformation game, right? I mean, the Ukrainians have their own interest in inflating. I mean, the Ukrainians have done what they've done to fight back against Russia is absolutely extraordinary. From a moral perspective, there's little room to doubt that like the Ukrainians are on the right side of this. That doesn't mean that they don't have their own agenda on spreading certain. I mean, I wouldn't say misinformation, but they have an interest in exaggerating the troop losses by Russia, of course, right? So it's hard to verify that stuff. It was interesting in one of the Russian state-affiliated online dailies. They accidentally published this figure that close to 10,000 Russian troops had died in the war so far, which, as you say, is an absolutely astounding number. I mean, forget in the US, that's more, by the way, than the US has lost in Iraq and Afghanistan combined in the past 20 years, right? So the Russians have lost in 20 days, if that number is true, which, the military analysts I look at say it seems reasonable. Russia has lost more in 20 days than America has lost in the past 20 years. It would also be the largest troop loss for Russia since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, right? I mean, add up all the casualties in the Chechen wars of the 1990s, all this stuff, still less than what they've lost in the past 3 weeks. So it's a very good question. How is that not bringing people out on the streets? I think there's two things. One, the government has gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal those numbers. They're not openly reporting them, is one thing. They're making it difficult for press to report or find those numbers, right? Because again, there's a law that says if you're spreading fake news or disinformation about the war, you can go to jail for up to 15 years, right? So that is a very strong coercive element telling people don't even go looking for this stuff, because if you so there's a lot of self-censorship that goes on. I think it's also, people don't want to talk about it if a relative has been killed in the war yet, because they are scared of what can happen to them. I mean, I have a good Russian friend in New York who has a relative who her husband was killed in the war. And he said, a journalist friend of ours said, "Hey, would you mind if I rang her up to talk to her about that?" And he said, "Absolutely not. There's no, I don't even want to put my relatives in a position where they could get in trouble for talking about the actual death of a family member." Right. So I think, on the one hand, it tells you how much the government is doing to suppress this information. But what that tells you is that's the thing the government is probably scared of most, right? The Russian government is not scared of like young tech hipsters in Moscow going out and protesting against a war that they don't like. What they are scared of is a large number of Russians, those provincial Russians in the smaller cities, the people who do support the war right now saying, Jesus, why are our sons and husbands and brothers coming back in body bags? What's actually going on in Ukraine, right? And if you think back, I don't know if your listeners will know this, but the Chechen wars in the 90s, one of the biggest effort to stop those wars came from what were called committees of soldiers' mothers, right? Who were like, the image of the soldier's mother is a tremendously powerful one in any society, but particularly in Russia, because it goes back to like World War II stuff. There's a whole thing about that in Russia. And they organized and they exerted tremendous pressure on the government to stop the First Chechen War, even at losing to the Chechens, basically. That's the type of thing that I think really worries the Russian government right now. If the news gets back from soldiers returning from the front, either alive or transmitting what's happening on the front by arriving home in a body bag, that's what they're worried about.
Alex, before we let you go, I'm by the way, I'm glad you gave that historical reference about, the Russian mothers, because we had Marie Harf, the former State Department spokesperson and advisor to Secretary Kerry on, friend of the show. And she said something similar about Russian body bags coming home to mothers. And then I heard, from the Senate Intel Committee, Mark Warner talking about that earlier today on CNN with Wolf Blitzer. And it got me thinking about everybody's unified on that's one way to stop this, right? Potentially, if we go back historically. But how does this conflict end in your eyes? Put on a prognosticator's hat. You mentioned about inflation in European countries. There's a bunch of different mitigating factors here, but like, where do you see this finally netting out? Is it peace talks? Is it, in terms of both sides coming to some sort of agreement, in terms of what the Russians want versus what the Ukrainians want? Where does this all shake out? When does it end? What do you think about all of this?
Boy, that's the toughest question in the world right now. Let me try and answer it. I think the first thing is, to even get there, we need to have a desire for this to end from all the relevant parties, right? Russia, it's not clear to me that Vladimir Putin necessarily wants this to end yet. I think he would like to gain as much territory as possible, particularly in southern Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. If it's impossible to take Kiev, which it may well be, fine. But I think he would like to at least open the book for peace talks or conflict resolution with as much of southern and eastern Ukraine under his dominion as possible. The Ukrainians, look, they're, again, as we've said, they've put up an absolutely historically heroic fight against a much larger army and inflicted just unimaginable casualties on it. Before this war started, people thought it would be over in 3 or 4 days. Here we are a month later, and the Russians have 10,000 body bags, and Kiev is still standing. Clearly, President Zelensky has to be very careful about how much he pushes, resisting the Russians and smashing them at all costs versus the humanitarian costs of an increasingly brutal and wanton, wantonly destructive Russian campaign, right? I mean, that's always the challenge for, leaders who are fighting back in cases like this. You don't want to be seen as pushing things so far that people start to say, my God, we can't take this anymore. We absolutely have to find a way out. So I think, Zelensky has floated some things that he might be willing to agree to, whether it's, strategic neutrality of some kind or some kind of Russian language rights, all these things. But I don't think the demand for a peace settlement as such is there yet on the Ukrainian side. And on the American and European side, I think that's one thing that, as we talked about at the top of the pod here, the Europeans and Americans have to get together and say, under what circumstances will we lift sanctions? And I don't think there's a clear answer to that question either, right? If the fighting stops, does Russia get sanctions relief? Maybe, maybe not. If Russia agrees to relinquish, 400 square miles of Ukraine, does that get them a sanctions relief for their banks and SWIFT? Like, nobody knows the answers to these questions yet. I would say, look, things that seem very unlikely to me, I think it's very unlikely that the Ukrainians are going to fight the Russians all the way back out of southern Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. I think in any peace talks or settlement talks, a significantly expanded Russian presence in southern and eastern Ukraine from what it was in 2014, I think that's going to be on the table and probably as a baseline. I think there is a world in which Ukraine becomes split in some ways. You have a Ukraine that southern and eastern Ukraine either becomes formally or informally part of Russia, and the rest of Ukraine sort of forms its own thing and tries to take that thing westward, joining the EU, potentially joining NATO one day. I think that's way, way off in the distance if it'll ever happen. But I think the two extreme outcomes, which is Russia is bloodied and beaten and driven all the way back across the Donbass into Russia, that's not going to happen. And I think it's also not going to happen that Russian tanks are going to roll all the way to Lviv and take over all of Ukraine. So I think some kind of halfway uncomfortable peace, frozen conflict is probably the best we can hope for.
Alex Kliment, check out his work at GZero Media. Check out his Trump impression on Twitter. It is a must listen to. Maybe we're running out of time, but you got to check that out. Follow him on social media. He's a great follow. Alex, we appreciate the time. You're welcome back on the pod anytime. The best of luck to you. I know you got a little one at home, just like I have a little one at home. So you're probably not sleeping. So you probably need to go to sleep. Get some rest, Alex. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Mike, Nick, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.